Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3, the middle of page 1216. Closer to the bottom of 1216. Okay. So just to sum up, the Rebbe Rashab has been explaining essentially the process, the step-by-step process of creation, from the source all the way to Nivraim creation, with Atzilus playing the critical role of being like the interface that God creates, that God created, that goes from Keser through the 10 spheres, Chochmah and the 10 spheres, into Malchus, which in turn will create Biyah, which is a world that is, consciousness is disconnected from the divine. It's not purely a divine extension like Atzilus is. It's in order to fulfill the purpose of creation to make a direh b'tachten, as he said on page 1215. And this is what the verse Ani Rishon ve'ani Achron is referring to. Ani Rishon, I am the first Rishon Keser, higher than Reshis, the first emanation. In the language of Chassidus, Rotzen, the first thing is God desiring, wanting something. That Rotzen in turn will inform and create Chochmah, which is the beginning of the design, a Nekuda, called Reshis. We're like Bereshis, Bara Lakim, Bereshis, Reshis. That Chochmah will be Nitztayer, shaped and formed into details through Bina, which in turn will take on even more shape and form and more body, so to speak, in the Midas Zah, all the way into Malchus, and Malchus being a faculty or an attribute different than all others, as we learned 2 pages back, a koyach nivdal, a separate faculty that doesn't reveal, but rather just expresses that very desire to have a malucha, to have a nation that God has authority over, has sovereignty over, is nasus, over the Am, and that in turn will create Nivraim, which are like the Koyach Nivdal, also separate from the source, with the intention that they reconnect and reunite with their God, with their king, and with their source. So in essence, it is about the interface, except we're talking about it now in the context of Keser, Ani Rishon, Malchus is Ani Achrin, Vani Achrin. These two are connected because it begins with Keser, which we learned before is wedged in Malchus. Malchus is wedged in Keser. And from there comes the next stage of creation. That's what we learned all the way to the top of page 1216. Now, the next paragraph was to go break it further down. Remember, the interface is always intent on finding every particular stepping stone. So really, literally, we have the ability to climb, the ability to understand God's process, and ability to retrace the steps. So if you're going to have stepping stones, you want them to be as close as possible. So the next stage in Malchus itself is also encompassed the 10 spheres. Malchus Gamkin Klulam Esses Sefiros. So let's review what we learned about that. So he began by saying Keser Malchus. The Keser within Malchus is the Rotzen Lemelucha. So the Keser, general Keser, the desire for Atzilus, is the whole Atzilus, the whole process. But now we're talking about Keser and Malchus. So in Malchus itself, more on a microcosmic level, is the Rotzen Lemelucha. And he began by explaining an example. We went through this example, and the example is of a coronation of a king. That when you crown the king, the point of it is to be ma'oder, stimulate within him an active and conscious desire to be king, l'melucha. So even though he has it within his psyche beforehand, we learned this already, but it's good to review. Within himself, it's concealed. As I explained at length, there are many things we have within us, and it's concealed. We're not even aware of it. And the coronation or the crowning is to reveal, is the revelation of that exalted Malchus Dika state. What manifests in the Rotzen. Okay. So Keser Malchus is the Rotzen, which needs to be revealed, and that is what Keser Malchus is. By putting the Keser on the Melech, you're essentially stimulating that desire. But then he broke it down into a few levels. That there's the actual ruling over the people. There's the desire, the awakening of a desire. And even before that, there's the revelation that he has isnasus. Sometimes a person could have it, talking in the mashal now, and not even know that they have that quality, that leadership quality, or that exalted uniqueness, as we spoke about. Many people don't think they're unique. They actually think themselves as inferior. So you need to reveal this nasus. This nasus has to turn into a rotzen, and then comes the step where he actually begins ruling, begins implementing, you can say, or actualizing that rotzen l'melucha that comes from this nasus. So he says, "Ein zaydaim b'chinas isnas al am mamish, u'be'emes hu ha'izgalos this nasus hasmi she'itchila behelam ba'atzmi." It's the truth is what it is the revelation of isnasus that was there concealed, and through the coronation, through the keser, it gets revealed, it comes and becomes into a state of revelation. And then he says, he breaks, and then this includes also the rotzen. Ubepratis, he says there are two things. One, revealing the isnasus, like I just explained, and the second is the rotzen, actual desire, an active desire to actualize the isnasus, but it's not the actualization yet. Okay. Then he went, that's all a mashal. And this is all a dugma. Hadugma is yuvim b'malchus d'rekia. From this we'll understand as it is the Malchus in heaven, the kingdom in heaven, the kingship in heaven. And what did he say? He said like this. Remember, as I explained, in heaven, by the Eibishter, you can't say that he is not aware, or in a sense like he's lacking. So there, it's because he's above awareness. In other words, for Elikus, that's beyond any structure, beyond any definition, to be engaged in creation requires a stimulation that he should want to do that. Not because of a weakness or because of lack, but rather the opposite, to bring him down to that manifest level, as I explained. So he says, Malchus d'Atzilus, the same thing with Malchus d'Rekia, which is Malchus d'Atzilus. The Keser Malchus d'B'chinas Rotzen, Goli l'Melucha, but it's not yet the actual Malchus ruling over Biyah. Al Elamis Nefrodim, Nevroim Nefrodim. In other words, you need another step to actually create, but you have the step where he wants to do it, the desire. What is the next step that actually does it? That's Malchus within Malchus. Remember, we said in Malchus there's all the 10 spheres. So Keser Malchus is Anir Rishon, the beginning of the process that he wants it. There's a revealed desire. And Aniyachin is the end of the process where it actually is being implemented and actualized. Malchus Sheba Malchus, like he says, that is the words he uses. Malchus Sheba Malchus Zabchinis Isnasus al Elamis, but it's still in the form of Makif, because even when the king is ruling on the people, he's still not one of them. He still remains above, but there's a state before he relates to them directly. So essentially, it's different levels of Isnasus, whether it's revealed or concealed, and then revealed, and then there's when he actually relates to the nation, to the people. But it's also in the form of makis. And then he gave the example. He described this in context of Rosh Hashanah, which is on Rosh Hashanah we draw down and reveal the Rotzen the Melucha, HaMelech HaKodesh. And also, in other words, that we want God to want to have a relationship with us. And two, that it's also v'gam, it also includes the higher level. There should be a revelation of God's fundamental state of exalted and state of grandeur of Reimamus. I think that's where we stopped, if I recall correctly. Or did we go a few more lines?
That's where you stop.
Okay, so we continue reading now from the 11 lines from the bottom of page 1216. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you don't have an actual printout, or so you can look at ayinbeis.com. So we're going to start from the words where I just stopped. Gili harotzen is okay. Yes, Yesh Lemer. So now he starts from Yesh Lemer. We're going to start. Actually, 6 and 9, 13 lines from the bottom. Sorry, it's 13 lines from the bottom. Yesh Lemer. And we can say the Kamoisha B'chinas Keser d'Atzilus. Just as Keser of Atzilus, we know, is Kolol Meb'chinas Atik v'Arich. Keser breaks into two dimensions. Atik and Arich. Atik is a higher level, Arich is a lower level, but they're both within Keser. Sometimes they're compared to Tainug and Ratzon, pleasure and desire, or pleasure and will. And they have different applications that we've learned. Atik, of course, being, like we learned, Atik is the Tachteina Shebemaitzil, being more reflective of the emanator, the source, and Arich is Rishon L'Netzolim, the beginning of the emanations, from which will then come Chochmah and the revealed faculties, the revealed attributes. So that's Atik and Arich. So he's saying, so just like in Keser of Atzilus, which is encompassed from Atik and Arich, he's now going to apply these two levels to the two levels we just discussed about Isnasis and Ratzon. It says like this. Remember, here we're talking about not the general Keser of Atzilus, but the Keser within Malchus. The Malchus itself has a Keser all the way, a Keser of Malchus, all the way to a Malchus of Malchus. It says in this Keser, same thing, in Keser Malchus, Yesh B'zeh Beis Inyanim. It also has two dimensions. His galus the Isnasis Atzmei, his galus, the revelation of the core and essential state of exaltedness, which could be concealed. So Atik is that revelation. And the second thing we spoke is an active desire for kingship, for ruling. So that would be, I'm sorry, I skipped the line. No, I didn't say it right. I said, Yeshlem, so to speak, the revelation of Isnasis Atzmei, the Gili Harotzen is B'chinas Isnasis Alam. And the Gili Harotzen, the revelation of the desire, revealing the desire to be Isnasis, not just that he's exalted, period, but it should be Al-Am in relation to the nation. However, okay, 1 second, before we go to the however. So that's Atik and Arich. So these two dimensions is, you see it clearly, Keser, in Keser itself, these two dimensions. She says, these two things we just said, and we compared them to, we related them to Atik and Arich, the revelation of this very state of supreme state, and the desire for kingship. Even though it's not yet an active leadership, actively serving as king, it's setting the stage for it. It's like a step before. So it's not yet the actualization of it, of the actual kingship, because that could happen. That could happen in time, or it can happen a little afterwards, or even if it's immediate, it's a third stage. Canal. Nevertheless, hu hasiba liyas b'chinas isnasis al-am. Nevertheless, these two stages are the cause that will lead to stage 3, the actual thing. In other words, you can't become an actual king if you don't want to be one, and if you don't feel that sense of isnasis, of that special quality of that type of exalted state. So even though it's not yet translated into an actualization, but it's the cause for it. So now he's introducing the word siba. Till now, didn't use that word, even though it makes sense, but now he's spelling it out. That is the cause. I'll take questions shortly. Let me just finish the subject. So here, the siba salam, the b'chinas sisnasus atzmi, kameshahu behelam ba'atzmi, because the sisnasus atzmi, the way it is, behelam, concealed within the, whether it's individual or we're talking about within the divine.
I think Reb Yuval Harpik accidentally turned on his microphone.
Okay, so the b'chinas atzmi kameshahu behelam ba'atzmi yachal yishlo yovel days galus. In other words, it's not automatic, and it's a given that just because a king is leading the nation, that it would just be a fact. It could have been this nasus atzmi. In other words, his personality of being a melech could remain concealed and not be revealed. Again, it's possible that it wouldn't come to a state of revelation, which is exactly why you need to stimulate it, and which is why we need Rosh Hashanah. It's not a given that the Eibishter wants to create. It's true that God initiated it in the first place when he created existence. There was no one there to stimulate it. And we actually learned at length in volume 2 what the process of that happened. How did that work out? God envisioning the tzaddikim, like he says, or that he envisioned the tzaddikim, so even though they weren't there yet, God envisioned it, and the first time it was initiated by the Eibishter, by God. But after that, it has to be initiated by us. It's called halos ma minei obey. But it's not relevant so much to this discussion. I'm just pointing out that there's a discussion where did it come from in the first place? In other words, God himself chose to reveal it. And from then on, in other words, God chose to create a human being. The first Rosh Hashanah, before there was a human being, there was no one there to stimulate. So it's so to speak, a stimulation from within. But after that, the stimulation comes without. So bottom line is, hisnasus atzmi is a state that can remain concealed and not come out and not be expressed in a revealed way. Like it says elsewhere, shekol keach atzmi kameshahu notua be'etzem hanefesh, that every core faculty, the way it's notua, it's planted or embedded. Notua, of course, from the word that something is rooted in etzem hanefesh. We're not talking about an acquired skill. We're talking about something that comes from the core of the being. Like I mentioned, for example, a chacham, a person can be born with a particular powerful mind or a particular powerful musical talent. And the list goes on. I'm just using those as examples. Through life, for all we know, some of it may never be revealed or none of it could be revealed. So something that's natua be'etzem hanefesh means it's an inherent faculty. And like he finishes the sentence, it's possible that it shouldn't be revealed. And in fact, we don't even know. Right now, you may have a faculty embedded in your genetic makeup, in your DNA. We're not talking about, again, acquired. It's within you. And for some reason, it wasn't revealed. Even to yourself, you may not be aware. As a matter of fact, most talents and skills, they get revealed not because one day you wake up and say, hey, I happen to be musical, or I happen to be a good writer, or I happen to be have a good mind. It happens often. Either parents or educators recognize and they still cultivate it and help nurture it. Sometimes it happens, so to speak, by accident. You end up having to do a job that that no one else was going to do, and you end up doing it and you realize, hey, you know what? Something I know how to do, or I see I can learn how to do it. Because remember, at the end of the day, we also need training, even a brilliant person. My point he's making here that it could be natua be'etzem hanefesh yachal yishlei izgala. So the same thing with hisnasus atzmi. It's possible not that it shouldn't be revealed. That's why you need that sibur. You need something to reveal it in order to implement it. Remember in the previous page, he quoted Samach to Samach Tofresh Nun Zayin, which is a maimer the Rebbe Rashab said at the wedding of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's a long maimer. It's considered one of the classics, one of the fundamental Maimorim. So where was it? We learned about it. Where it was on page, remember the last page? Yeah, right top of page 1215. He brought about it when he spoke about Isnasus. Yeah. That the human being has a nature of Isnasus. Okay. So there he also talks about this point, that it could also remain concealed in Samach to Samach. Aval kasher Bobby is galus. But when it comes into a revealed state, has a siba ligiluyim shiavoyim ameno. So that's when it remains concealed, dormant, you can say, like a dormant state. But when it does come revealed, it becomes the cause for the giluyim, for the revelations that are derived from it, that emerge from it. In other words, like he said, Atik and Arich is the giluy of the Isnasus is Atik. The Ratzon, the desire, an act for Melucha, for kingship is Arich. It's still not actualized as meaning it's an actual desire, but it's not an actualized king yet. He's not yet an actual king. But on the other hand, the actualization of being king is the cause for it is the revelation of the Isnasus, which could have been concealed, and then you wouldn't have had the next stages. But now that it's revealed, it becomes a sibah for the giluyim that come from it. Okay, Valkain, and therefore, b'chinas izgalus hisnasus atzmi, the b'chinas Keser Malchus, and therefore this level of hisnasus atzmi, this core essential state of exalted and elevated state of Keser Malchus, harizeh b'chinas siba liyes b'chinas hisnasus alam. So the hisnasus atzmi, that core elevated state, becomes the cause for the Isnasus Alam, the elevated state in relation to the nation. As I again explained that back in the end of volume 2, talked about Hoid, Hodar, Hoid Melech and Hadras Melech, that one is the king is exalted, but he's in his own private chamber. It's not necessarily in relation to the nation, not relating to them. So a person can be in that state, senses their elevated state, and that's that. But then there's Isnasus Alam as he relates to the nation, which is, of course, the activation of Malchus, which is Malchus Sheba Malchus. So the Sibah for Isnasus Alam is Isnasus Atzmi, and Isnasus Alam, Shehu Isnasus al Ha'elamis. That's already the elevated state, the transcendent state over the worlds, meaning Biyah. In this case, the Kolshkein, this is Isnasus Atzmi, the revelation of that, like Atik. The Kolshkein, the b'chinas Ratzon Hagoli l'melucha b'chinas Siba. And for sure, the second level, which comes from the first, the desire to kingship is definitely a cause for being actual king. But even the first level is the cause, because if you don't first have the revealed elevated state, you're not going to have the rest. But remember, Ratzon Luch is a step closer to actual being king. So you have the 3 steps here. The cause of Isnasus Atzmi becoming revealed, the Ratzon L'Melucha, which is even closer to actualizing, and then the actualization, which is a result of the first 2 levels. But here he's focused more on the first level, because he basically wants to say that Ani Achrein is rooted in Ani Rishon. Malchus is rooted in the Keser of Malchus, which is essentially what he's saying here, the Sibah. Not finished the subject yet, but this is where he's going with this, the Rebbe Rashab. Okay. We'll stop here for a sec if anybody wants to ask anything. Then I'll continue. So we're now 3 lines from the bottom here. There's more to say on this subject, so it's not a finished topic, but any questions?
Siba means cause.
You have another word? I mean, Siba, Ila, both are cause. Siba is Siba Mesubah, cause and effect.
Yeah, no, it sounds it's a lot better than reason.
Yeah, here Siba means more like cause, like the catalyst, if you wish, like the cause and effect type of thing. Not so much like a Siba, give me your reason, because it's not necessarily a rational reason. However, it's the cause. It's like something, if you have an effect, something is causing that to be that way. Yeah. continue on, or you have anybody has any other questions? Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab continues. V'gam, another factor here, another point to make. V'gam, in addition, this state of isnasus al elamis, which means that elevated state relation, the melech is now melech ala'am. They are listening to his commands, to his authority. He's governing them, he's guiding them. So you have now an active relationship between a melech and a am, which is still a melech. It's not he became part of the am, but now there's an active relationship. In the parentheses, canal. Because remember, the isnasus is still the relationship as melech, and that became the mokir, the source for Isavus. He said that, where did he say that? At the top of the end of the paragraph from the top of the page. So he said that once you have, so it's really a fourth step now. Now, with a king, a human king doesn't create his nation. But Lamaila, you have the concealed state of this nasus is dormant. It gets revealed in Atik, in this case, Atik of Keser of Malchus. It becomes an active desire. It now becomes an active kingship, a relationship with the Nam. That automatically creates the nation. Because once you have the desire, and once you want to actualize that desire into a relationship, it necessitates a creation of the Nevrayim. So that's what he explained. Just want to look exactly where the Lashon was. I think it was also earlier. Let me just see. Yeah. In other words, he associates the third level, the actualization of Malchus and Am, with his Savus. But you have to say it's like two steps in that process itself, the creation of. So when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, for example, so we stimulate God's isnasus, that exalted state, that elevated state, that turns into a ratzon, a desire to want to renew the contract, so to speak, with existence and be a melech. That in turn was going to result in actually becoming that melech over the am, and that is why God renews the contract with the world and recreates the world at Rosh Hashanah. So conceptually, it could have stopped right there. The world could have ceased. But all this it creates that God should desire to recreate the world and with new energy, not just to keep it in maintenance mode, but new energy. So his savus is a critical component here because Malchus doesn't just rule over Biyah, it also creates Biyah. Now, in the human example, you can't really say that because a Melech does not create his nation. He doesn't give birth to them. I mean, you can say he creates the concept of a nation, that till now they were just individuals and now they come together to be his, under his sovereignty. But real creation, we're talking about creation of existence, like we're speaking Bereshis bara lekim, from Keser, Rotzen, to Chachme, all the way to Malchus. The active process of creation is, what he says in his parentheses, is rooted in isnasus al elamis. But if God did not apply himself to relate to existence, there would be no creation of existence. So in other words, if it stayed in a state of hisnasus atzmi, even if it's revealed, and it stayed in a state of ratzon l'melucha, desire, if he did not apply himself to create, it could all remain in that state. Now, obviously, the kavanah, the intention of God is to create. But if you talk about it in a logical process, you can have a plan. You can have, you can have a sense of your own state of, let's say you want to build a home. You could even have the desire for it, and it could end up being something that's never implemented. You stay with the plans. Now, of course, above, God doesn't have that limitation. So there's no going to be any delay as a result of procrastination or running out of funds or something like that. But the point is, it is stages. It's still logical, progressive stages, and there is a hierarchy here. So he's saying, he says the gam, we still didn't understand what the gam is, but we'll get to that. So gam, which is the source. Interesting, he uses the word mocker now, not sibba, mocker. Because mocker is always closer than a sibba. A cause can be from a distance. You can cause an effect without being actively, directly connected to it. It's like a Siba, the fact that God wants or has Isnasus Atzmi revealed is ultimately the cause for the revealed and desire, and ultimately for the actual becoming king. But Makir, generally in Chassidus, Makir is usually something close by. Like, for example, a king can give an order, and that's the Siba for why something is done. But who actually makes sure that that order reaches the intended audience? That's more like a Makir. It relates to. So now Malchus, Keser Malchus is a Siba, but it's not a direct link. Whereas Makir is when you say something is direct. It's going to be relevant in a moment in understanding that even though creation comes from a koyach nivdo, like he said, if you remember, we spoke about this. Nevertheless, creation is also by cutting close, koyach hapoel benifel, that God invests his energy in creation. It's not just from a distance that he says, I want creation. And this is extremely relevant to the context of the whole interface, which I want to explain in a moment. Let me just read a few more lines. Then I'm going to pause to explain this, I think, in a way that make it a little more palpable or palatable. So he says like this. He says, which is the source for the creation of the worlds, as we said before. So now he's making another connection between Malchus and Keser, but the other way around. Not that Malchus is rooted in the Siba and Keser that's above it, but Malchus itself becomes the Keser, the crown for the next stage, Biyah. So the Rotzen of Keser, which came from the Isnasus Atzmi being revealed, in turn turned into a Malchus, an active relationship, but Malchus now is turning into a Keser, a Rotzen of Bria. And the parentheses are going to explain, in other words, Keser is applying itself to create, and it's still in a form of Malchus and Keser, so it's still Makif and removed, but it's now not just an active desire that's above the whole picture, it's now actively involved. And what does that mean? So in the parentheses, he explains, V'hu inyan koyach hapoyel hakloli, shenizbar li'il dibra maskul, anechia aleph. This is the koyach hapoyel hakloli, that when you say the power of the producer that actively involves himself in producing, it's because koyach hakloli, not koyach haprati. I'll explain that as well in a moment. That was discussed earlier in the Maimer Nechia Aleph, and as he's referring to, well, below they say that maybe it should be v'lekachtem lechem, because I guess they didn't find the subject in Anechi. So regardless, they refer to volume 2, page 674. I'll look it up a little later. But regardless, what he discusses there is there's a koyach hapoel hakloli, shezehu, next page, 1217, b'bchinas makif adai. So it's still also makif. As I said, I'm going to explain this whole section in a moment. I just want to read it inside. And v'sav b'poel, so now yet another stage. And the actual creation, b'bchinas kiruv, in a state of kiruv and closeness to creation, heina asius are the letters, vatsirufim, and their permutations. The letters we know have tzirufim, different combinations that a letter can have, a Hebrew letters can have. Hatzirufim haprotim, the detailed permutations or combinations. Shein keches haprotim, these are the specific faculties. Shein b'chinas pulis protis, which comes down into actual specific actions and functions, I should say, better functions, specific functions. Commotion is boyasham, as was explained there in the Maimer, but they are referring to v'lekachtem, that the Rebbe Rashab called Anechi. Okay, so now we have yet another thing in Malchus, that after all the earlier stages we discussed, Malchus now becomes in turn a Keser for the next level, and that's the koyach klali hapoyel, the producer's power, the general power that creates, still makiv, and then comes the koyach hapoyel benifel proti, where he specifically relates to each particular form of existence, which would be already a pnimi, an internalized mamala kalalmin element. Okay. So let me explain this with some examples. There's a lot of levels here, but they're vital because they're all part of the process of understanding how creation happens and also how we can retrace the steps and reconnect to God on all these levels. Now, you recall, I'm sure, and if not, I'll refresh your memory, that I'm just looking for one word. I wanted to just see something on the previous page, which is relevant here. I just want to make sure I find it here. Okay, yeah, I found it. Recall at the end of volume 2, there's a long discussion about the two levels of Ayin, the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. So this Yesh Amiti is the source, is the true reality, God. Yesh Hanivra, on the end of the spectrum, is the created reality, us, existence. In between is like a channel, an interface, a mamutza. It's called Ayin. In general, that's Oyer. It's Oyer Ein Sof. But there's two stages in that Ayin. One Ayin is a reflection that reveals Atzmus. It's called the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. And the other Ayin, why is it Ayin of Yesh Amiti? Because it's completely bottled, Ayin, completely nullified in the presence of it revealing its master, like we spoke about the chief of staff of a king, for instance. And the second level of Ayin relates to existence. It's called Ayin. It's the divine energy that manifests into existence and relates to existence. So it's two different Ayin. Why is it called Ayin? The second level, not because of bittul, but because it's not something we can relate to. Yesh ma'ayin. We say yesh, this is the yesh, and the ayin is an unknown, or it's of a different substance. So we call it ayin like as unknown, or a different reality. So when you talk from the yesh amiti and the ayin amiti, which is what he called it, there it's ayin miyesh, not yesh ma'ayin, because the yesh amiti comes first, God's reality, and then the ayin reflects that in being just a reflection, a completely nullified, a bottled reflection to its source. When you talk about the lower two, you say yesh ma'ayin. The reality is the given reality is the reality of existence from our perspective. And then we discover that it really comes from a state of ayin, a divine energy that we can't relate to directly, but it's there. Now, why is this so relevant? Because you'll see how we apply it here. So what you have here is these 4 steps really help us understand how, in a logical way, how a God that's completely removed, how he created a process where it goes from gradation to gradation, stage to stage, progressively, until a yesh is created. Now, of course, there are many levels in those ayin. In that ayin itself, there are many levels. We learned that as well, especially when we learned Tzadik Dalet, Tofresh Tzadik Dalet, the Refridik Rebbe turned it into a whole many more levels. So to use an example that we can relate to, the operative example I've always been using throughout the learning is the artist and the art. But we'll also use the example of an architect and or someone, not an architect necessarily, someone wants to have a home. They're very similar examples, but each one reflects another dimension of this. Let's start with the artist. So we know like this, when you go from the bottom up, you look at a piece of art. Okay, you study the art, beautiful. It inspires you, it has a lesson, it has a message. From the artist, you come to discover there has to be, from the art, you come to realize there has to be an artist who made this piece of art. How much of the artist does the art reflect? Not something, but not everything. Because the artist may have created and could create 1,000 other pieces of art, millions of different pieces of art, each one reflecting another sentiment of his, or another part of his personality, or his life experience. I'm talking even on a human level, not even talking about God. Okay, so from the art, you've come to an artist. You've not met this artist, so you know that there is an artist. You know that the artist must have something, some relationship with his art. It's expressing something of his. But then let's say you hear from somebody, I met the artist and he told me his life story or something like that. Now you know a little more about the artist. Then you come to meet the artist, you get to know even more. But you still see him as an artist, still relating as an artist. Now you come to realize, 1 second, his whole identity is defined by being an artist? Absolutely not. He or she could be a father or a mother, a brother or sister, a child, and may have other talents, and usually does. So you come to realize that the art, as much as it reflected part of the artist is a whole nother reality. Now you're talking about the source itself, the artist. And as you continue to extrapolate, and you continue to climb, so to speak, and get to know the artist as much as what you can, you realize that actually art is just one little thing among infinite amount of things that he's capable of. Not just infinite amounts of art, that he's a whole different person. And you realize there's a whole personality there. You come to realize he's a major Talmud Chacham, for example. And he learns Torah all day. And art is just a hobby of his. He's a good artist. And the art is reflective of something of his. The point being that you can climb from something that you understood and come to realize that the one who created it is far, far beyond the creation. It still is creation, and as such reflects something of him. But the question, how much? As you keep going, you come to realize that the art doesn't even matter. This artist, the art is not his primary interest, even though he wanted to create it. And I'll go a step further, because in the Nimshal we'll need to say this. You can even say this is what he really wants, this piece of art. But it does not reflect necessarily all his grandeur and everything about him. I'm going from the bottom up to the point you come to discover that really this individual is beyond the art he creates. He's beyond the everything else that you know about him. All definitions, he can't be applied, because in the essence of his soul, he's a completely removed entity. Now, this is how it would be from Avodah. If you apply this now to Avodas Hashem, the same idea. You come to realize first, Mamala Kalaman, the divine within existence, what it does for you, the blessings you get from God, the sustenance, the life. That's basically all the birchas hanenin, the blessings we say, thank you, God, for giving me health and life, and all the different brachas we say in the morning, or throughout the day, on food, or on benching, or whatever it may be, or different events in our lives. You come to discover that God is beyond just sustaining you and the world. There's dimensions higher than that. You come even higher to realize that he's beyond, even beyond. So in the language that we've been learning, from Amala Kalami, you come to Sevav Kalami, but you come to understand a state of transcendence, that God transcends existence. This is another way of saying Malchus. He's higher. He's not the sum total. Yes, he created existence and therefore has a relationship with it because he chose to do so. But fundamentally, he's in a transcendent state. It's another way of saying hisnasus. And then you come to realize he's not just transcendent in regard to you. That would be level one. He's transcendent fundamentally. In other words, it's like saying you're a big chacham only when you're a very wise person compared to others. But then there's a wisdom that you're fundamentally in a different piece of cloth. He's made of something else completely. So you come to realize it's nasus atzmi, to the point that you come to realize that he didn't need that either. So therefore, God is what he is. So how did it go from God that's beyond transcendence even over creation? How did that turn into a transcendence over creation and then ultimately engaging with the world and manifesting within it? So you realize all this is a process that has to be stimulated. That's what the Eibishter wanted. So in this context, I will now move from the top down. From the Eibishter's perspective, so yes, Nesavar Kodesh Baruch Hu dir b'tachtenim. Why, we'll never know. Because you can't ask a question on a type. That's what Atzmus wants. Or I should say desires. That puts into process a whole series of steps. Because since it's tachtenim, it needs to be a structure. And a structure necessitates a plan and a design. Again, not because God needs it, God can do whatever he wants, but he wants us to understand it and wants us to relate to it and have a relationship with it. So the process begins, not jump straight into creation, because then we would never have a relationship with God himself. So God said, first I will manifest and I'll extend my reality into a divine state of consciousness called Ur. Ur Ein Sof. It's a field of energy. It's a field of divine energy, seamless, shapeless, completely dedicated only to one thing, revealing God. In that field of energy, think of it like a quilt, an infinite quilt, just as a muscle. He will then create, the next stage will be the stimulation of isnasus, the concept of transcendence, but a transcendence as beyond anything, not because it relates to anything. It's just fundamentally a transcendent state. But that too needs to be put into place. That transcendent state then in turn will turn into a desire to manifest that transcendence in a way that others can appreciate, meaning a creation. It's all within God's consciousness right now. It's all lifnei tzimtzum. Or in the context here, let's say Keser before Atzilus, in the microcosm. That will then turn into, okay, now comes the step of actually envisioning creation, which we're going to learn about. He didn't talk about that yet. And then the creation process itself. So the Keser Malchus, whether it's Keser within Malchus or Keser beyond Atzilus, or even Keser like I'm talking now before the Tzimtzum, is a state of transcendence, but there's no revelation about it. Then there's the revealed state of transcendence. Then there's the revealed Ratzon, Atik, Arich. Then comes this Malchus of Malchus, or Malchus in general, Malchus of Ein Sof. That is the active process of turning these higher states into a reality. And what's the reality? That now a world is created through the Tzimtzum and the Parsayas and so on, not getting into the exact details, but it's created with distance, because there needs to be a concealment of all of this, because existence can never be sustained, can never stand as an independent reality as long as the divine consciousness is dominant. So you need to conceal that. The new consciousness of the independent consciousness of existence has now been manifest. And now you have a Malchus, the Malchus which carries all that into creation, also is still a state of transcendence. It's still higher than existence, but it relates to existence. And its relationship itself is two aspects. One is what he calls the Koyach HaPoel HaKloli. That God now is a Koyach HaPoel, he's a producer. He's now an artist. He manifests himself in being an artist, and actually first a Koyach HaPoel HaKloli, general ability to create art. And then the specifics when Hashem says, Vayhi Oir. You can say Koyach HaPoel HaKloli is like Bereshis, Bar Elokim, Bereshis. So it's Chachman, includes everything within it, but it's still in a concentrated state. And then come the Tzir Proti, the details. Vayemer Elokim Yehi Oir, Vayhi Oir. Vayemer Elokim Yehi Rakia, Vayhi Rakia. That basically the details where the divine energy is now applying itself specifically to each particular creation. It's still divine energy and not the creation, so it's still higher. But now you wouldn't use the word isnasus. Well, he doesn't say that word. You'd use the word koyach hapoel benifel, that is actively involved in the creation, engaging with it, and actually channeling the particular yehi oyer, like he says, the oisiz with sirufim of the asar mamoris, of all the words that God will use to create. But he specifically states it, yehi oyer. That's far different than speaking about, in general, I want a home, I want a creation, which would be more the koyach hapoel hakloli of Keser, Malchus, that becomes Keser. And if you go even further back, it becomes even more general. So basically, it's essentially a step from something that's completely beyond anything, chooses to want to create something and have a relationship with it, but in a logical sense, where you want to have all the steps covered, you want to make sure nothing is compromised, that God is not compromised, that you have the highest levels of isnasus, while you also have the divine energy as it comes and relates to the nation in a specific way. So every level, therefore, represents and reflects another dimension in the relationship. If you want a relationship with the highest levels of the divine, obviously, you need to climb there. But you begin always from the bottom up, from the lowest levels, because it's very difficult to experience God in his full glory if you don't experience God as he relates to you, which is much easier for you to come. It's much easier for us to experience. But then you continue to climb. So essentially, what he's saying here is not just a bunch of levels. I wanted to take it away from the mechanics of it and the science of it, but really bring it down into what are we really addressing here. So here you see they're both infinite distance as well as the relationship. And Malchus, of course, is a very critical word because Malchus carries both elements. On one hand, it's a melech, so it's transcendent and above, but from there also comes its relationship and specific, because the melech will send the chief of staff, and then he will send each head of a department, and he will be involved in every specific detail, hashgacha pratis, of every part of creation. He doesn't delegate it, but it specifically relates to it. But that doesn't define him, because Eibishter ultimately is transcendent, and transcendent beyond transcendent, as the discussion, as I just explained, hopefully in a way that helps make sense of this whole idea. Okay. So that was a mouthful.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, one second. Yeah. So now I'm opening up to questions. Please, go ahead.
Everything that you said with the mashal with the artist is very good. But I think that after all, there is, of course, a difference between the artist, the Moshe La'atzmoi, and the Eibishter, Kifisha, who, because with the Eibishter, the Nisave is a koyach retzoni. The artist, even the mocker,
Of course. Every mashal has to be qualified. Obviously, a mashal of a physical artist can never reflect God in his fullest sense. But I'm trying to give an example of God wanting to work. The reason an artist works that way is because God himself wanted it to be as much logical as possible. But of course, all of this comes from fundamentally from a state that's beyond anything, and everything is coming from Rosh. Yeah, correct.
I have a question.
What's that? Shlomo, you wanted to follow up with that, or that's that?
That's fine.
Okay.
I just want to bring it up,
but yes, it's correct. It's totally, absolutely correct. You have to always qualify when it comes to God. You say kavyachol at the end of the day.
Sure.
So my question, just to help us relate, if you will, to this, it's really the Seder Istalshlus, the Seder of creation, and ultimately to relate to the Eibishter. Just for example, to take us back to the end of Chelek Beis, toward the end of Chelek Beis, talking about Cholas Ava, and the sort of the ultimate lovesickness and yearning for God is to get to a state of Re'iyah, which is a very high level of hisbonenus, contemplation of God. I grant that. I should only get close to that. But what level of revelation, or what level of this unfolding process you just described, what level of Elokus would Re'iyah relate to? So what would I be looking at? At what point would this unfolding become discernible to a human being, even at the highest level of human discernment?
Well, the Rebbe Rashab said very clearly, the Rotzai, which is the yearning, is on every level. He spoke about 3 general levels. One is the Rotzai from existence, yearning to connect to the energy within existence. That's like from Bria Biyat Atzilus. Then there's the yearning of Atzilus to connect to that which is higher than Atzilus. And then there's higher Atzilus to connect to its source. In truth, is if you break it down, every level, it's all about longing, because as you become more aware, in using the example of the artist, of the deeper levels of the divine, the transcendent levels, it all becomes a source for that longing that we look to seek to be able to connect. So you really can apply it to any of these levels. Every level has its rotzei. That's the whole point of it. That once you contemplate and you come to appreciate godliness on whatever level it may be, you want then your yearning, you long to connect to it.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, so the next section on page 1217 is going to tie, the Rebbe Rashab is going to tie together even more of the subject that we've been learning. So far you didn't see the word tzimtzum or parsa, But now he's going to talk about how another aspect which is vital here, because in order to maintain the balance, is that on one hand it's godliness, on the other hand, we cannot be annihilated in the process. The expression "Heishit Tatzboi," that God stretches out his finger and it causes a malach to burn up. Because if this is not regulated properly, and you don't have the proper balance and channels, it could also ultimately cause something that's not wanted. Like when you have Nadav and Avihu, or the four that entered into the orchard, and the Gili Alakus can be stronger than the Kalim and can create a problem. So it's vital that there be regulators throughout the process. So that's what he's going to go now and say, Vihine. And I'll read a few lines and then Mashanasa Keser Lebriya. That when Malchus now is becoming relating to Bria, which is after all the levels we've learned, Snasas Atzmi, Ratzon L'Meluch, revealing this Snasas Atzmi, that transcendent state, the desire for kingship, the actual kingship, the creation, that when Malchus is so-called channeling this energy into creation and becoming a Keser of Bria, from being a Malchus of Atzilus, that comes after the partition between Atzilus and Bria. You may recall when the question that's still hanging here, that all this began to explain, was how can you say that Atzilus is in Bria, in Gan Eden, when we need to have the partition? How could it be unfiltered? So he's not answering the question yet, but he's now introducing that from Malchus to become Keser of Bria, to put in the analogy I gave, for that state of transcendence, even if it chooses and wants to have a relationship with the nation, it's still a transcendent state, godliness is. So how then does it relate to Bia? Yet it needs yet another diminishment. And that's called the parsa, the curtain or the partition between Atzilus and Bria. Which means, explicitly, specifically after the concealment of the energy, the parsa is a concealer. Only then is it possible for Malchus to become a crown of Bria, through piercing this curtain. So in other words, you need the curtain to conceal, and then Malchus, that's now in a state of concealment, can now pierce the curtain in a more diminished way. Remember, Ur Shel Tulda, he called it, like like a secondary light that's now been diminished, and become the Keser of Bria. Via Dua, and it's known because you could say, 1 second, does Malchus become Keser of Bria before the Parsa or after the Parsa? He says it's known, this almus, that this concealment, Zehu Gufa Hu Aidei Snasus the Bechinas Malchus. Okay, actually, 1 second. He's going to say what I just addressed a little later. But let me just stop for a moment. So now he says, it's known. Let's just pause a moment. Anybody have any question about this last section with the Parsa before I read the Yudua? Because it's like another, we need to take a pause. Okay, if not, so here's what he's going to say now. Remember, and this is vital in the context, because now you can not ask a question, but it seems like 1 second. Didn't we say before on the previous page, on 12, 14, and 15, that creation could only come through Malchus, not through the Midas, not through the emotions, because they are all in the state of Kiruv. They're revelation. And to create something, you need a state of distance. That's why Malchus is perfect for that, because Malchus is a Koyach Nivdal. It doesn't reveal much about the one who's a Melech, and its form of manifesting is through distance, not through closeness. So then that alone should be the reason that creation could happen. That's what he said. But now we've added that the Parsa comes into play. So what the Rebbe Rashab says to explain this, he says, Yadua, that this is Salmus itself, the Parsa isn't just an outside force. Malchus by nature creates distance. Because when you see a melech, both al pi halacha and al pi nature, there's an emes hamelech. You feel a certain sense of awe and even fear, that you're not just an equal to this king, you stand with a bittul. So Malchus elicits an element of concealment. That's what he's saying now. So the psalmist itself comes through the isnasus of Malchus. The Inyan isnasus, and explains why. Because this state of transcendence, or this elevated state, who b'chinas havdalah v'yisalmus, is a level of separate and concealed. So he's equating concealed and separation here. Remember, concealment doesn't always mean, as we usually hear it, concealment as in Helam Hagolus, the concealment, Haster Aster Panai, that God concealed himself, and unfortunately, when tragedy happens. We're not talking about a concealment of that nature. He's talking here concealment more as in the king cannot be in a revealed state with his subjects. That's why there's the din. A person is not supposed to see a king take a haircut or a king bathe. Why? Because he's not your equal. You may know that he's taking a haircut, but there's a certain element of Avdallah, like when we say Kedusha, Kadeshim, Kaddish, like in Kaddish Kashem. When you say that, God, Kedusha from the word Avdallah, that he's from a different entity, he's beyond you. So here he means his Salmus in that context, that it's not he's coming and revealing himself to you. It's not like a husband and wife or brothers or friends. There's always an element of separation and being removed, like aloof to a certain extent, and concealment. That's what his snasus is by nature. And down below they cite, that's page volume 2, page 691. And actually that's the period. That's what was discussed there. So in the Kutta in the beard, Mimana is a mimer in Bolok. So there he talks about Vayam Emed Aleim. Yam is Malchus. Emed Aleim, like it said by Kriyas Yamsuf, it stands above you. So he's referring to how Malchus always in a state of above and transcendent and removed. And that is exactly what causes the parsha to be a parsha. Now, how that works exactly, he didn't spell out, but clearly he's connecting the separation and the concealment of Malchus, like he says, Zeh gufay de snasus de bechinas Malchus. In other words, if Malchus was very close to creation, the parsha would not be able to emerge, because it's like a close. A parsha means there is a partition. Why is there a partition between the Holy of Holies and between Kodesh Kadashim and Kodesh, and the same in different parts of the Mishkan? It's a partition because one is very much holier than the other. So its exalted state itself dictates a state of separation. Separation has a partition. So the parsha is a direct result of the higher level of isnasus of Malchus. So when a king is a king, he's in his inner sanctum and you don't have access to him. That's what the parsha does. It creates a type of a leap and a separation between Atzilus and Biyah. That's what he's saying right here. I'm going to stop here. Now it's going to be a parenthesis, going to explain something in this concept itself. But I'll stop here for today. If anybody has any questions, please. But if we do stop here, basically 7, 8 lines into page 1217. Any questions?
So the parsa he's referring to here is the distance itself acting as a parsa, or does the parsa have any sort of?
He doesn't spell it out, as I just said. He doesn't spell it out more than what he says here. Basically, all he says is that Yedua, that only after the concealment of the the Yedua de Salmu Zel Gufa de Snasus. So the concealment, that itself. I mean, other places it talks about it more in detail. We'll see what he says here. If need be, I'll explain it further based on the Maimorim in volume 1, where he talks more about the parsha in volume 2, especially, and also volume 2 at length. The parsha is like anything. It's like a tzimtzum. It's a concealment. And Malchus is not the power of concealment, but Malchus contributes to the concealment and allows for it. And so the Koyach HaTzimtzum, the Koyach HaTzimtzum comes through Malchus, which makes sense. And that's.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop here on top of page 1217.